Before we begin today's episode, I have one quick thing to say. This is the 200th episode of Freelance Writing Direct, and I'm so thrilled that we've reached this milestone. I want to thank every guest who has shared their wisdom, their advice, their experiences. And thank you to my audience, to everyone who listens, watches, subscribes, and supports the show. It's been such a joy to create these conversations, and I can't wait to bring you so many more and so many exciting episodes to come. Now, on to today's episode, and thank you again. Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and today I am extremely delighted to have Brenda Miller with us. And if you don't know Brenda, let me tell you all about her, because she is such an influence on writers everywhere and actually coined the term the hermit crab essay, which she wrote about first in her book, Tell It Slant. So Brenda Miller's new hybrid collection, Love You By, A Daughter's Journey in Essays and Poems, is just out from Skinner House Books. She is the author of 6 additional essay collections, including A Braided Heart, Essays on Writing and Form, and An Earlier Life, winner of the Washington State Book Award for Memoir. Her work has received 7 Pushcart Prizes. She co-authored with Holly J. Hughes, The Pen and the Bell, Mindful Writing in a Busy World, and with Suzanne Paola, Tell It Slant, Refining and Publishing Creative Nonfiction. And her website is brendamillerwriter.com. Welcome, Brenda.
Oh, thank you, Estelle. It's just a pleasure being here. Thank you.
So you have a new collection out, and I wondered if you can talk a little bit about the collection, and then we'll just get into talking about your writing in general.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the new collection, as you said, is called Love You By, which is a phrase that many of us say kind of offhandedly, but I write about how my mother used it. And the essays and poems in this collection are pretty much about shepherding both my parents to and through end of life. And I've been a hospice volunteer for many, many years. And I also am a threshold singer, and we sing at the bedsides of those who are ill or dying. So all of that work informs the pieces in this book. So it's my first hybrid collection that includes both poetry and prose, and that was my editor's idea. And I was just delighted to have this kind of book come into the world.
And so in the forms that you use many forms in the book. Can you share some of the forms you use?
Sure, sure. Well, of course, there's poetry, which is its own form, but even within that genre, I use some formal constraints like, pantoums or villanelles and that kind of thing. And then in the prose, many of the pieces, especially in the first section about my dad, are very short prose poem-like pieces, little vignettes. And then I have longer essays that are braided essays, so have many different threads and research going through them. And then some hermit crab forms as well. So there's one piece about my dad that's written in the form of a letter to the wound care center where he had an appointment the next day. So in this letter, I try to express how important this appointment is to him. And so through the letter form, I get at some very deep emotional material.
Wow. And so is that also like using the hermit crab form through the letter form? I love the whole concept of it. I mean, I know it, but I want to hear you explain it because you're the mother of invention there.
Yeah, so the hermit crab, as I describe it in Tell It Slant, is just a metaphorical phrase I came up with when we were writing the very first edition of Tell It Slant way back in the early aughts. And at that time, there really wasn't a catchy name. I didn't invent the form, the form's been around forever, but they were called like borrowed forms or just things that didn't have a real catchy name to them. So a hermit crab, the creature itself, borrows a shell in order to live because it doesn't have its own shell. And they're very vulnerable creatures without these shells. And so I was watching some hermit crabs in the tide pools around here. I live in Bellingham, Washington, so we have lots of waterfront to explore. And it occurred to me that these essays that take on existing forms out in the world are very much like these hermit crabs who need to find something to hold them in order to survive and live. So a hermit crab essay takes on a form such as a letter, a to-do list, a menu. It could be anything. There's so many possibilities. And then uses that form in order to tell the story. I find these forms to be so much fun to write, and at the same time, they are usually the most honest and real essays that I write. It's an interesting paradox, and I find when I teach it, students just come alive. You know, they're able to come out and play, and especially with material that's tough, all of a sudden it just becomes material that we can shape and play with.
Yeah, what did Nora Ephron say? Everything is content, everything is material.
Absolutely.
I love that. And I got my start in journalism and service journalism at Woman's World in the beauty department. And so I was so used to the form of the service journalism. You would put something in a low cost to high cost format or in a report card or something. And so that was just the form, which is so important for journalism. But then the way that it's used, the way that you talk about it in an essay, I love that because then you get to the emotional depth and you can really use this impartial form to add in all these really painful or difficult things to write about. And the form kind of protects it, much like the hermit crab, has the shell. So I just think it's such a brilliant way to convey stories, to convey emotion. And you talk about it in both your books in A Braided Heart, Tell It Slant is where you first spoke about it. And in A Braided Heart, you talk to your students about lyric essays, I believe, in one section. And it's about braiding different elements into it. Can you first talk about the braiding of the elements, which is, again, it's the form to the function is just so important. And then would you mind reading a section that you wrote?
Yeah, so the braided essay again has been around for a long time, and I was thinking about the image of the braid and the way different braids come into our lives. And being a Jewish girl, a Jewish daughter, the challah, the braided bread, seemed the most resonant to me. So when I was asked to write about braided essays, that was the metaphorical image that I ended up using. So in braided essays, usually there's three or more. If you do two, that can work, but for a true braid to happen, you kind of need three threads going through. And so in a braided essay, you might have a narrative of a memory or something that you're working out in your mind. And then you might have a thread of research that connects to this topic, this theme that deepens it. And then you might have a thread of another voice, like poetry or recipes or anything at all that, again, just connect. The author is not making direct connections and telling the reader how to connect them. Instead, through the juxtaposition of these threads and the way they both continue and get interrupted, the reader is making the meaning as well. So again, it just creates more of an interaction, both with the writer and the material and the writer and the reader.
Yeah, and I love Joanne Beard's The Fourth State of Matter, which just puts so many braided elements together. And what I've noticed with braided essays, and I was a judge for the Writer's Digest personal essay contest for a number of years. And one of the pieces that won used weather. So it was talking about the emotional climate of a relationship. And then it was about the rolling storm coming in. And I thought it was so cleverly done. And I wanted to ask you, is nature a big element in braided essays?
Certainly can be for sure because it's all around us, right? So in my new book, Love You Bye, there's two essays that are kind of pivotal to the book, and one is about my dad and one's about my mom. But for my dad, it's the image of frogs. This little frog kept showing up every year on my dad's death anniversary. And my mom and dad had collected frog figurines all of their married life. And so it naturally became this braided essay with just the sighting of the frog year after year, and then the memory of all the frog figurines in my parents' home. And then all this research about frogs, who are amphibious creatures who live in two worlds at once, you know? And so and then fairy tales that involve frogs, right? And so you just kind of go on and on. And again, that's when you start having some fun with the material. And once you start having fun, then the reader is just going to be very actively engaged as well.
And I believe you said that if there's like a third person impartial voice, that can be very effective. Can you tell me why that is?
Well, because that third voice, especially if you're directly quoting either research or other literature, then it can convey information that might be a little cumbersome for you to do in your narrative first person voice, or it can just bring in a whole different register. So, for instance, in the essay about the braided essay, which I do in a braided essay form in order to enact it, I have the voice of like the recipe for challah coming in, right? So all of a sudden there's this other disembodied voice that's not my voice, but it belongs to the essay itself.
Can you read that section? This is from A Braided Heart.
So I was asked many, many, many years ago to write about the braided essay, as I said. And I actually wrote this piece mainly in my head as I was driving to Wyoming for a writing retreat. And so I had the assignment in my head. And as I made that very long drive, all the pieces started forming. And then when I got to the retreat, I wrote it in 12 hours, just like start to finish. So that doesn't happen all the time. And then when I got there, I asked the cook if I could look at her cookbooks and find a recipe for challah. And so, so you're just kind of using whatever's around you. And whenever I'm in the thick of a braided essay, all of a sudden everything starts connecting, right? And so you just start finding connections wherever you look. And then the trick is on revision, what really fits. Like you can really overdo it. So then you need to start paring down those braids so that they're nice and neat.
So it's all the synchronicity starts happening. I think there's a scientific term for that, right? Like you're aware now of everything connected to what your mind is working on consciously or unconsciously.
Exactly.
Now, before you read that part, can you just tell me with the disparate threads, how does each ending of the thread of each time it's mentioned need to connect to the next part? Because that's the thing that I think my students struggle the most with.
Right. That is what happens in revision, right? So, you let yourself get caught up in the synchronicities and all these wonderful connections you're seeing. And then after you've written that draft, then is the time to really look and discern what is this essay trying to be about. And once you decide on that, then it becomes clear what belongs and what doesn't, because usually a braided essay has to have white space, section breaks in order to differentiate the threads. And so, as you say, the endings of all of these sections really need to be jumping off points to the next one. And it doesn't have to be directly connected, but having some kind of resonance or echo that brings you in to the next section. And you might not even as a reader notice it, but you will notice that it's flowing along and you're carried along this momentum of the essay. And then what often happens for me in writing a braided essay are echoes. Like I'll pick up a phrase I used earlier and bring it back later so that the threads are kind of talking across one another as well.
I've talked about something called the echo effect, sort of a term that I coined when you find something, you pull it in and you pull it in the beginning, you pull it in at the end. And so with the braided essay, that's even more effective. So can you read the hollow part? And then I want to go back to more of the braided discussion here because this is fascinating.
Okay, so this is called A Braided Heart Shaping the Lyric Essay. On the first day of my class writing the lyric essay, I bring in a loaf of challah, the braided bread traditionally eaten for the Jewish Sabbath dinner. I take it out of my bag and set it on a white cloth at the center of the table. Before I say anything at all about it, I watch my students' reactions. Some eye it warily, some avoid looking at it altogether, and some seem delighted, hunger evident in their eyes. I pass out the syllabus and watch the stapled packets make a circuit around the room, the challah still sitting placidly in the center of the table, innocuous yet full of mysterious power. I don't talk about the bread, but I begin some forays into the lyric essay in general. What is it? That is the main question we all have. I might even write it on the board. What is the lyric essay? Not only what is it, but how do I make it? What's the definition? What's the answer? And I might tell them, I don't know. I might tell them, though they won't want to hear it, that we've entered a realm of unknowing, a place where definitions are constantly in flux, a place where answers are not as important as the questions to which they give rise. The challah. So this particular piece has subtitles for the sections. So that's one way to organize a braided essay. Some braided essays only have an asterisk or maybe just white space. So all of these ways of differentiating the braids are also part of the effect that you're going for in terms of how fragmented is it, how connected are they, etc. The challah. I loved challah when I was a child. It had to be bought from a special kosher bakery, the Delicious Bakery in the Hughes Shopping Center, and we had to get there at just the right time on Friday afternoons before the loaves were sold out, and after they had just come from the oven, still warm, the egg wash and the sesame seed gleaming like gold. They seemed, in fact, the golden loaves of some fairy tale, minted from a factory deep inside a hidden cave, emerging on a conveyor belt and counted out for all the Jews of Northridge. There were a good many conservative congregations in the San Fernando Valley, the California Jews, whom the East Coast Jews frowned upon or dismissed. There's a joke. California Jews are not really Jews, they're Jew-ish. And I suppose my family fit that description. We went to synagogue when necessary, and my brothers and I went to Hebrew school. I thought the men looked both distinguished and ridiculous with their yarmulkes on, the contrast between the elegant black silk and the womanish bobby pins used to hold them in place. My brothers took them off as soon as they could, but sometimes my father absent-mindedly left his yarmulke on through the rest of that sanctified day, preoccupied with a piece of wood in his vise on the bench in the garage, or sitting with his feet up on the recliner, watching a Lakers game, waiting for dinner to be served. Though we were secular Jews, we were still Jewish enough to appreciate the quality of the Sabbath bread, that beautiful glowing challah. I recently asked a rabbi on the internet why the challah is braided, what is symbolic about it, and his email reply said in a voice so much like those rabbis of my youth, slightly contemptuous, a little annoyed, that the Sabbath bread must only look different than everyday bread, that it need not be braided. It could be circular or oblong or in a rhomboid shape for that matter. The braid had become custom for Eastern European Jews. Some bakers used three strands, some four. This rabbi, he said with a hint of pride, used six. As a child, I knew only that the braided bread simply tasted better than ordinary bread, the way texture will often affect flavor, and the way presentation and form can sometimes themselves offer sustenance. I loved watching my mother cut through that jeweled crust, the heft of the buttered slice in my hands, the convoluted, lacquered outer surface giving way to the dense bread beneath. The inside was moist and delicious, tasted like an entire meal in itself. I often closed my eyes when I bit into it. Here was a bread that spoke of what it meant to have a sacred day, to bring the divine into one's small and common body. And then the next section is called Braiding the Challah, and here's where I use a quote from the recipe book. And again, you're differentiating the braids with different tones. And so what I've done so far is I have kind of the voice of my teacher self, right? This is what I do in a classroom. And then I have my memoir self doing a memory. And here in Braiding the Challah, it's a direct quote from the recipe book, and I have it in italics, which again differentiates it a bit from the others. Braiding the challah, divide the dough into four equal portions. Roll each between your hands to form a strand about 20 inches long. Place the four strips lengthwise on a greased baking sheet, pinch the tops together, and braid as follows. Pick up the strand on the right, bring it over the next one, under the third, and over the fourth. Repeat, always starting with the strand on the right until the braid is complete. So, and then it goes on. And then I pick up these different instructions as I go through the essay.
Yes, and you use more of the instruction. You use the teacher voices back in. You label something, the next part about the recipe, taking risks. And you talk about the bakers needing the soft dough. So you're escalating in the process, in the emotion. Then you go back to the memoir memory, but you're tying in now with when you made your own bread. So it's the teaching, and there's so much more, right? Now, the French braids, was that part of that as well?
Yeah, so this is where I'm starting to, my brain's firing, like, what other kind of braids? And so I think about the braids on girls and how I can never do them, and having kind of pseudo stepdaughters that I was trying to win over. And, sure, I'll braid your hair. And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, right? But then again, why do we like braids? What do they feel like? And yeah, so you just allow yourself, even if you don't know yet if it's going to make it into the final piece, just go ahead and write it. You don't know yet. And then you can decide later what really belongs and how much of it to give airtime to.
Do you do an exercise either for yourself or with your students, like a mind mapping? So if you're talking about challah, you're talking about braiding, then you want to maybe put in terms of Jewish life or Yiddish or Hebrew, and then braiding, you're thinking of all different kinds of braids. And then, of course, the deeper emotion within each. It's fascinating. And this is a tough format to master. And you're like, this is so much fun, which I love.
Well, I think that is the key. I mean, I think so many of us and students in particular, they're so busy and everything's an assignment and it's work, and they start feeling very belabored with it. If we can somehow allow joy and playfulness back into the writing process, it's going to come much more easily. And again, getting rid of, for at least a time, that editorial voice that's saying, what are you doing? Is this going to be worth it? Is this going to make it into the final product? It's all product oriented. And so let's get back to the joy of writing we had as kids. I used to use in my teaching Linda Barry. Do you know her work?
Yes.
Yeah, so she has several books on creativity. She's a comic artist, so her books on creativity are just wild. I mean, they're just, it's like looking into someone's sketchbook, just pictures everywhere and arrows. But she has some wonderful writing exercises online. You know, we can even write with her online, where she just brings us back into that sense of joy and playfulness and not overthinking before you even set pen to paper.
Yes, I feel sometimes that we can belabor our own writing. And so it's true, like just do the dump draft at first. And then sometimes I just leave it alone. I go to watch, reality TV or something like that. My brain can relax on that way. And then you come back, and it's almost like your brain has been working. And then you're like, oh, I get it. This belongs here. Then it's the editing part. It's right brain, left brain. I think a lot of people, when they're first starting out, I have to explain that to my students because they want to be perfect. They want to get it right. And that's why I do a lot of like, we're going to just write this, we're going to handwrite it. It's expressing and putting it on the page, and then you can always massage it later.
You know, I just give examples from my own writing process, which evolves over the years. It's not as if you're going to stay in the same process forever, but I call it scribbling because when you're scribbling, you don't expect it to be great or doodling, right? You're just kind of scribbling. And I do it in the company of others. And that's why I always highlighted writing in class and allowing yourself to just get into that rhythm and allow the focus and energy of the class to be a gift because especially in the world now, it's so distracting and to just have 5 minutes even where all of you are focused on the same task, it helps. It bolsters you, just like taking a fitness class or a dance class, right? It's much easier to get into it with others. So I always write with others now in one way or another, either in person or online. And I have a few different groups I do that with. I don't even have the kind of writing group where you bring in work and get feedback because I find that kind of stifles me now. I just need a group where we're just getting words on paper and cheering each other on, right? So in class, you have that built in. So use it, treasure it, right? And find your people. Find the people you will be writing with for a long time.
Yes, yes, that's great advice. You need to find like simpatico people, especially when it comes to the vulnerability of writing. So, however that works. And you talk in a braided heart about finding community, about writing groups, about how it's most effective. I think making it not subjective, if people are going to make comments, is really helpful because everyone comes from their own perspective. How do you phrase that if you're asking people to critique or to comment?
Well, usually, especially if we're just drafting new work, no one's required to share any of it because I know that would inhibit people right away as well. But in one particular group I work with that I do my own writing in, and we've been doing it for years and years, we have very specific writing tasks, I guess you'd put it. So for the first 5 minutes, we're writing very, very short sentences. And then for 10 minutes, we're writing chaining sentences, which is the last word of a sentence becomes the first word of the next sentence. And then for 20 minutes, we're writing one long sentence without stopping. And we've been doing this for so long that it's just automatic for us now. And we start the writing with just a random word that we pick out of a pile of words that we've written on scraps of paper. So we're all writing from the same word. And we do read out loud what we've written after each little section, but there's no feedback whatsoever at that point. And then at the very end, all we do is speak back to the whole group the phrases and words that stood out to us that stay with us. And that's it. So it's just kind of like, oh, I wrote that. It's like, oh, yeah. And we're looking in our own writing. Oh, yeah, that was a good phrase. And then I might put that away for quite a while. And when I come back to my desk by myself, I have a whole notebook full of scribbling that I can then start typing up and seeing what's there. And probably about half of it becomes things I end up working with, and the rest is practice, and I think that's another thing that gets lost is the idea that writing is a practice, the way you would practice a sport or practice music, that not everything has to make it to the final stage. You just need to keep those writing muscles going.
So you would take the last word. So let's say you're saying, your latest book is about caregiving. And so you're ending with your father. And that was the gift I gave to my father. And then you would maybe do a bit of dialogue. Father said to me, or father gave me, like you would just continue with that.
The chaining is probably the funnest one because it does force you into these weird grammatical syntaxes that you might not use otherwise. And when you're typing those up, you wouldn't necessarily keep it in that form, but by having that technical challenge, again, like with the hermit crab, your brain is working on the challenge of the form, and then all this wonderful material comes forth without you having to censor it. Right. So the chain and the long sentence, they both create their own rhythm and momentum that just kind of keeps you going along. And ideally, you're having some fun with it. The long sentence, there are times when you're just writing, is it time to be over yet? Is it time to be over yet? But what that long sentence does is it forces you to just break through to just keep writing. And then usually at that point where you're like, I don't have anything more to say, that's when a lot more comes up. And with all of the writing, there's also a phrase you can use if you do start getting stuck, you just write, what I mean to say is, da, 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 and then you just kind of keep going. Or I've been doing a writing group with the poet Elizabeth Austin for a year or more now. She has been doing a Friday morning gathering where we just get online with her. She does a little grounding exercise, or someone else does. She reads us a poem, not necessarily her poem, any poem that she's picked, reads it again. And we're just kind of in this poetic language. Then she gives us a prompt for writing, or we can just write whatever we want to for 10 minutes. And then we come back and people can share if they like. But what she does at about the two-thirds of the way point in the writing, she uses the phrase, what else is true? What else is true? Right. So all of these things are just ways to, again, keep yourself writing without cutting yourself off too soon.
Fascinating. And you have a hermit crab essay, I believe, that really kind of went viral. We regret to inform you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that was a fun one. And that's a great example of everything I'm talking about. So, yeah, it's a piece called We Regret to Inform You. It was published in The Sun. And it's in the form of rejection notes, which we are very familiar with as writers. And they always have a particular form or voice. Thank you for sending us your work. Unfortunately, da, da, da. So, especially the form rejection letters. So, I was teaching a class on the hermit crab form. And the way I structure the class is that we brainstorm a lot of forms that one might use, even the ones that are right in the room with us, a syllabus, a textbook, whatever. And we just start scribbling them on the board until the board is full of forms. And then I ask people to choose a form and allow the form to dictate the content. So instead of thinking, I have this big topic I want to write about, and now I need to find the form for it, instead, find the form first and see what that form might elicit in you. And so we had all the forms on the board. They were writing, and I wasn't writing because I thought I don't need to do the exercise. I've done it a million times. But it gets boring watching other people write. So I look at the board and I see rejection notes. So I just start writing rejection notes. So what the form suggested was the topic of rejection, right? Not necessarily rejection of my writing, but rejection throughout life, right? And then I'm off and running because, of course, we all have a million things we could write, right? And so then I'm just like, oh, what do I remember as my first rejection? And another key point is I'm not questioning what comes into my head. It might not be accurate. I don't care. I'm just writing what came into my head. Just go for it. Worry about accuracy later. And so, yeah, I just start with, oh, maybe it was that. And so I start writing the rejection note based on something in elementary school, and then as I get into high school. And so it becomes just this chronological litany of rejection. And I'm just having so much fun with it, right? And because my intellectual brain is just trying to get the form right and get the voice while all this other potentially very embarrassing material comes out.
You talk about being a step parent and the issues there. And I mean, you just go into it from childhood onward.
Right, having crushes on basketball player, all of these things. And then it gets to more serious stuff, right? Without me even trying. It's like, oh, this is coming up now. Well, again, I'm not going to question it. I'm just going to do it. So the part I wrote in class, which was like a 10, 15-minute writing exercise, just got me going. And then I just kept going on it. But the important thing too is, again, I'm encouraging people to just write whatever on those first drafts, but then you do have to go back with that discerning eye and see, because what happens when you're having too much fun is that, okay, you're having fun, but the reader isn't anymore. The reader's like, okay, enough already. I'm getting kind of sick of this. So that's when a trusted reader comes in, and they can go, yeah, it's getting a little repetitive here. And these are the ones that, were more engaging to me. And then again, I have to look for the deeper theme in the piece. So the topic of rejection is kind of a big umbrella, but what is it really about? What are these rejection notes showing me about myself or my life? And it became not so much about rejection, but about finding your way in the world and finding your own role to play. So that's what got me through to find the ones that fit, to highlight that theme, because then I'm rewriting a bit too, because now I know what I'm talking about. So that theme is getting massaged in there a bit. And it was hard to figure out the ending to this kind of essay, and it turned out to be an acceptance letter at the end, right? So there still has to be some form of craft involved in the shaping of the piece after you have the material.
Yes, I have some students who sometimes experiment with the hybrid form, the short form. And what I see is there are little vignettes, but there's no connective thread or tissue or deeper emotional stakes. So it, in effect, ends up more like a diary entry. This happened with my father, and then this happened with my father. And here's a little poem about my father. But there needs to be that connective tissue. How would you advise talking to someone about that kind of issue that they're dealing with?
Well, again, I would just ask that question as we're sitting together with the work. I'd ask, what is this really about? Now, it's about your father, but what is it really about? What kind of theme or image keeps coming up? And I try to hold off on saying what I see, because usually it's pretty obvious to me. But it's always obvious with someone else's work, right? But I let them kind of sit with it and think through it. And then usually what comes out in those conversations is material that's not on the page yet. So that's why I really encourage, instead of feedback on just what's on the page, is to have more of a conversation about the possibilities and what else is true, what else is true, right? And getting at the heart of what it is that they're doing. Yeah.
That makes so much sense, and it's so true. And I also see it in essays. This incident and this thing and that thing, again, without that connective tissue. And it's really when the writer doesn't really know what they're trying to say. So they want to say it all. They want to just throw it all in there because it could be important. Who knows? And a lot of times they want me to say, this is important, this is not important. And I have to say, what are you really trying to say?
Right.
Because to me, I can look like you and I could say, well, the weight of this seems stronger than this little vignette. But again, what is it that you want to say or share? And I think that deeper work is, as writing teachers, what we're always trying to get the students to do.
Right. And you could even phrase it as not so much what you're trying to say, but what is this essay trying to say? What is this poem trying to say? Right. So get it beyond your intent and your thinking mind and what is coming out in the writing mind. Because I think that's usually richer material, the unexpected. So that's what I'm also looking for if I have people looking at each other's work. It's like, what's unexpected here? What seems like a little surprise? And it just might even be one phrase, it might be an image, it might be a memory. Oftentimes, I'll work with photographs with students. And so we'll look at the photograph the way we often do, where you just see what it's about. And then we start looking at other little details, like what shoes are they wearing and what are they holding in their hand and who's that on the other side? And so we're looking for the unexpected. And then we're also speculating what happened right before this photo was taken, what happened right after this photo was taken, right? So you're looking for things that we don't already know.
I love that. This has been such a pleasure to talk craft with you, Brenda Miller, and we will continue this conversation.
This was delightful.
Follow me at estelleserasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.